The boy's name was Samuel Carter, and in 1859, no one in the small Massachusetts town of Blackridge knew what to do with him. He was 8 years old when the schoolmaster first accused him of cheating. Samuel sat in the back row of the one-room schoolhouse, feet dangling above the wooden floor, slate balanced on his knees. The arithmetic problem on the board had taken the older boys nearly an hour. Samuel finished it in less than 5 minutes, then solved it again, a different way, just to be sure. When the schoolmaster saw the answer, he frowned. "Stand up," he ordered. Samuel obeyed. "You copied this," the man said flatly. "Tell me from whom." Samuel looked around the room. The other children avoided his eyes. Some were afraid. Others were angry. A few looked ashamed. "I didn't copy," Samuel said quietly. "I counted it." "Counted it," the schoolmaster snapped. "Explain." Samuel leaded slowly. Clearly he spoke of grouping numbers, of patterns, of why certain figures behaved the way they did. His voice never shook. He never hesitated. The room fell silent. The schoolmaster's face changed not to pride, but to discomfort. That afternoon, Sam was dismissed early and told not to return until further notice. Samuel lived with his mother, Eliza Carter, in a small wooden house near the edge of town. She worked as a washerwoman and seamstress, her hands permanently rough, her back permanently tired. She had always known her son was different, but she had learned long ago that difference could be dangerous. When Samuel told her what had happened, she closed her eyes. "They don't like what they can't control," she said softly. That night, Samuel asked a question he had been holding in for months. "Why does my mind move faster than everyone else's?" Elisa looked at him for a long time. "I don't know," she said, "but you must be careful with it." Samuel nodded, but he didn't understand. To him, thinking felt as natural as breathing. Word spread anyway. Within weeks, people spoke of the black boy who solved problems grown men could not. Some dismissed it as exaggeration. Others insisted it was impossible. A Fuqua curious men wanted to see for themselves. One of them was Dr. Jonathan Whitaker, a physician with an interest in the emerging sciences of cognition and measurement. He arrived at the Carter home one morning with a notebook, a measuring tape, and an unsettling smile. "I'd like to ask your son a few questions," he said. Eliza hesitated, then stepped aside. Dr. Whitaker tested Samuel for hours. Memory, exercises, logic, puzzles, language tasks in Latin and Greek languages Samuel had never been taught, yet somehow deciphered through structure alone. The doctor's pen slowed, then stopped. "This isn't possible," he muttered. Samuel watched him carefully. "Why not?" Dr. Whitaker didn't answer. Instead, he asked more questions, harder ones, crueler ones, designed not to understand Samuel but to break him. Samuel answered them all. By evening, Dr. Whitaker left without thanking anyone. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived. Samuel Carter was to be examined by a committee of scholars in Boston. Eliza read the letter twice, then burned it in the stove. But it was too late. Science had noticed Samuel Carter. And science, in 1859, did not like what it could not explain. Samuel Carter had never left Blackridge before. The journey to Boston felt unreal, and rails screaming beneath the train, smoke filling the sky, strangers' eyes lingering on him longer than they should. He sat stiffly beside his mother Eliza, her hand locked tightly around his wrist as if the world itself might try to take him away. They were not traveling as guests. They were being summoned. The city that watched him, Boston, in 1859 was loud, restless, and sharp-edged. Horse hooves struck stone streets, carriages rattled past like machines with minds of their own, and buildings loomed taller than anything Samuel had known. People stared. Some whispered. A few pointed subtly as if politeness could hide curiosity. Eliza felt it immediately. This city did not see her son as a child. It saw him as a problem to be solved. They were taken to the Massachusetts Institute for Natural Philosophy, a grand stone building that smelled of ink, dust, and authority. Inside waited 6 men scholars, physicians, and thinkers, each convinced they were about to prove something. None of them agreed on what. The first examination, Samuel was seated at a long oak table. No toys or no comfort, just papers, instruments, and eyes. Dr. Whitaker was there, notebook in hand. "Samuel," he said, falsely warm, "we are only going to ask questions." Samuel nodded. The questions began simply: numbers, patterns, logic. Samuel answered calmly. Then they grew complex. Abstract reasoning, spatial problems, theories, not taught even at universities. Samuel didn't struggle. He expanded. He corrected a professor's flawed premise. He questioned why an experiment assumed limits that had never been proven. He proposed alternate outcomes before the men finished their discussions. One scholar laughed nervously. Another frowned. A third whispered, "This is unnatural." Samuel heard it. The measurements, they moved on to measurements. His skull, his reflexes, his eyesight, his pulse under stress. They compared numbers in hushed voices. flipping pages faster and faster. These results contradict established hierarchy, one man said quietly. Hierarchy of what? Samuel asked. The room went silent. Dr. Whitaker cleared his throat. Of intelligence? Sammy tilted his head. Is intelligence arranged? My skin. No one answered. Eliza stood up. This is enough. But they were not finished. Fear disguised as curiosity that night. Samuel was not allowed to return home. They said it was for observation. Eliza protested loudly, threatened, cried it did not matter. Samuel was placed in a small room with a bed, a desk, and a locked door. He did not cry, he thought. He thought about Patton's knock numbers this time. But people, how fear showed itself, how authority reacted when challenged, how intelligence, when unexpected, became dangerous. The next day, the committee argued among themselves. This could undermine everything, one said. If people hear of this, then our theories collapse. Or worse, social order. Samuel listened through the door. For the first time in his life, he understood something frightening. They were not studying him to understand him. They were studying him to control the damage he represented. Elisa fights back. Elisa did not sleep. She went to churches, newspapers, abolitionist circles, anyone who might listen. My son is not a specimen, she said. He is a child. Some turned her away. Some pitied her. One man approached carefully. If they publish first, he said, they control the story. If you dudes, the world asks questions. Elisa nodded. She had never been afraid of questions. A dangerous decision on the third day. The committee prepared a report. It did not praise Samuel, it reduced him. They described his mind as an anomaly, a deviation, possibly pathological, possibly dangerous if misunderstood. They recommended containment, further controlled study under supervision. Samuel read the draft when they left it unattended. He understood every word, and he understood what came next. That night, he did something none of them expected. He rewrote their conclusions. Not emotionally, not angrily, but logically, line by line, exposing contradictions, flawed assumptions, and unproven biases. He left the paper on the table and waited. When the scholars returned and read it, one of them whispered something that would follow Samuel for the rest of his life. This boy is not defying science. He is exposing it. The report did not stay inside the institute for long. A junior assistant, uneasy with what he had read and shaken by the boy's rewritten conclusions, slipped a copy to a printer on Tremont Street. By the end of the week, fragments of the document had reached abolitionist circles, coffeehouses, and finally the newspapers. They did not print Samuel's name at first. They printed the idea that a child contradicts established scientific hierarchy, a mind that defies measurement, an anomaly too dangerous to ignore. Boston reacted the way it always did, loudly, unevenly, and with fear dressed up as debate. Some editorials mocked the scholars. Others defended them. A few went further, suggesting that the boy's intelligence was not proof of equality but evidence of something unnatural, something that required restraint before it disrupted society. Samuel read every word. He was no longer a child being examined. He had become a subject of argument. At the institute, the mood shifted from curiosity to urgency. Doors closed more often. Conversations stopped when Samuel passed. The men who had once questioned him eagerly now avoided eye contact. One of them finally said it aloud. If this continues, he told Whitaker, we lose control of the narrative. Whitaker nodded grimly. Then we change it. They decided Samuel would be presented publicly not as a miracle, but as a caution. A lecture was planned, carefully framed. Selectively edited. His abilities would be acknowledged, but attributed to imitation, memorization, coincidence, anything but independent genius. Samuel was informed the night before. You will answer only what you are asked, Whitaker said. Nothing more. Someone looked at him calmly. Truth does not fit inside instructions. Whitaker's jaw tightened. Truth is defined by those who publish it. That evening, Elisa managed to see her son. They sat across from each other in a narrow room, candlelight trembling between them. They are afraid, Samuel said before she could speak. I know, Eliza replied. And afraid men do cruel things. Samuel hesitated. Mother, am I wrong to think the way I do? Eliza reached for his hands. No, but the world is wrong for punishing it. The lecture hall was full the next day. Scholars, clergy, city officials, even curious townsfolk who sensed they were about to witness something unusual. Samuel stood on the stage, small and still, surrounded by men who spoke about him as if he were not there. Charts were shown, numbers adjusted, conclusions softened. Then someone in the audience stood up. Let the boy speak, the man said. If his mind is the subject, let it answer. The room murmured. Whitaker hesitated too long. Samuel stepped forward. You say intelligence has limits, he said, voice clear. But you have never proven where they come from. He said, hierarchy is natural, but nature has not written, your rulesmen have. A scholar interrupted. This is not appropriate, Samuel continued. You fear what you cannot explain, but fear is not science, and silence is not truth. The hall erupted. Some applauded, others shouted. A few stormed out. By evening, Samuel's name was everywhere. So were calls to remove him from public view. That night, as guards were quietly assigned to his door, Samuel realized something profound and terrible. His mind was no longer the mystery. It was a threat. And in 1859, threats were not studied forever. They were contained. The decision was made without Samuel present. He learned of it the same way he learned most dangerous things, by listening. Two men spoke outside his door late that night, their voices low but careless. If he stays, one said, he becomes a symbol, and symbols spread. The other replied, we can't allow that. The word they used was not prison or asylum. I called it relocation. A quiet institution in the countryside. Fewer eyes, more control. Samuel lay awake, staring at the ceiling, counting the gaps between the boards. Not numbers this time, but time itself. How little of it he had left before adults decided his future for him. In the morning, Eliza was not allowed to see him. They said it was temporary. She knew better. She went to the printer again, breathless, voice shaking but firm. They're moving him, she said. If they do, you'll never hear from him again. The printer hesitated. If I publish more, they'll shut me down. Then let them, Eliza said. Truth is louder than presses. By noon, a broadside appeared across the city. Crude ink, hurried type, undeniable words. A child held by science who decides what a mind is worth. Crowds gathered. Arguments broke out. Ministers condemned the institute for overreach. Others demanded Samuel be removed immediately for public safety. Inside the institute, panic replaced planning. Whitaker read the broadside twice, then crumpled it. We move tonight, he said. No more delays. They came for Samuel at dusk. 2 guards. Polite, firm. Pack your things, one said. Samuel looked at the small stack of papers on his desk, the rewritten report, his notes, his questions. He took only one sheet and folded it carefully into his coat. As they walked him down the corridor, a door opened. Eliza stood there. Number 1 had told her. No one had stopped her. For a moment, no one moved. She crossed the space between them and knelt, gripping Samuel's shoulders. Listen to me, she whispered. Whatever they do, never doubt yourself. They are afraid because you are proof. Samuel nodded. I know. A guard cleared his throat. Ma'am. Samuel stepped back. It's all right, he said. I will come back. The certainty in his voice unsettled them more than resistance would have. They put him in a carriage. The door shut. The wheels turned. Boston faded. Behind him. Hours later, the carriage stopped at a low stone building surrounded by fields and fences. No sign, no name. Inside, the air smelled of medicine and quiet despair. A man with thin lips and watchful eyes introduced himself as the superintendent here. You will rest, he said. Think less. Be observed. Samuel was shown to a room with a narrow bed and a window too high to reach. That night, alone in the dark, Samuel unfolded the paper he had kept. It was not a calculation or an argument, it was a list. Names of men, statements they had made, contradictions they had admitted when they thought no one was listening. He added one more line at the bottom. They believe silence will erase truth. Samuel smiled faintly. Silence, he knew, only gave truth time to sharpen. The institution did not announce itself as a prison, but it functioned like one. Days followed rigid patterns. Samuel was woken before sunrise, examined, questioned, observed, and recorded. Every answer he gave was written down. Every silence was noted. The men here spoke softly, but their intentions were heavy. They did not ask what he thought. They asked how he thought, as if his mind were a mechanism to be dismantled. At first, Samuel answered, then he began to choose his answers carefully. He learned quickly which questions were traps and which were sincere. He noticed how certain responses made the men uneasy, how others reassured them. He watched their hands when they lied and their eyes when they feared being exposed. One afternoon, a physician presented a puzzle designed to confuse adults. Samuel solved it in moments. The physician frowned. Again, he said, rearranging the pieces. Samuel did not comply. I already know the solution, he said calmly. The physician's voice hardened. Do it anyway. Samuel looked at him. You are not testing intelligence, he said. You are testing obedience. The room went still. From that day on, the questions changed. They stopped trying to understand him. They began trying to wear him down. Outside the institution, Eliza did not stop. She traveled by foot, by borrowed carriage, by favors she never liked asking for. She spoke in churches, in private homes, to abolitionists and skeptics alike. Some listened, some warned her she was risking everything. I already have, she replied. A pamphlet appeared, then another. Samuel's words, carefully paraphrased, began to circulate. So did descriptions of the institution. The secrecy, the isolation, the lack of oversight. The men in charge noticed. Inside, Samuel felt. The shift before it was spoken aloud. Guards changed. Doors locked more often. His writing materials were taken away. You are agitating people who do not understand you, the superintendent told him. Samuel met his gaze. They understand injustice. The superintendent leaned closer. You are not here to inspire. Samuel did not respond. That night, he did something risky. During the evening rounds, he spoke quietly to an older percenter man who had once been a schoolteacher before he asked too many questions of his own. Do you still remember how to write? Samuel asked. The man nodded slowly. Samuel whispered instructions. Not plans of escape, though, would fail, but something more dangerous. Documentation, dates, conditions, names, truth, carefully recorded. Weeks passed. Then one morning the superintendent was summoned away unexpectedly. An inspector arrived sent by the state, pressured by public concern. He walked the halls, asked rehearsed questions, and received rehearsed answers, until he reached Samuel. What do you do here, son? The inspector asked. Samuel looked at him steadily. I am contained. The inspector paused. Contained. From what? Samuel's voice did not rise. From disproving assumptions. The inspector left without comment. 3 days later, orders came down. Samuel Carter was to be released back into his mother's care under conditions. No lectures, no publications, no public demonstrations of ability. The institution framed it as mercy. Eliza knew better. When Samuel stepped outside and felt the sun again, he did not smile. He looked older, quieter. Eliza hugged him fiercely. It's over, she said. Samuel shook his head gently. No, he replied. It has only changed form. As they traveled home, Samuel watched the world pass by towns. People, patterns repeating endlessly. He had learned something inside those walls. Knowledge alone was not enough. To survive, truth needed timing, and he was learning to wait. Samuel returned to Blackridge a different boy than the one who had left. The town looked the same narrow roads, same wooden houses, same cautious faces, but Samuel now noticed things he hadn't before. The way conversations stopped when he passed. The way adults watched him as if waiting for something to go wrong. His release had not erased fear, it had spread it. Eliza felt it too. Work became scarce. Some doors that had once been politely open were now quietly closed. People did not insult them openly. They did something worse. They avoided them. Samuel was not allowed back into the schoolhouse. The schoolmaster claimed it was for the boy's own good. Samuel knew it was for everyone else's comfort, so he learnt alone. Books arrived quietly, sent by people who'd never signed their names. Old mathematics texts, philosophy, fragments of scientific journals. Samuel devoured them at night, committing entire pages to memory, not out of pride, but preparation. He had learned restraint. He no longer answered quickly. He no longer corrected people in public. When asked simple questions, he gave simple answers. He had learned that brilliance, when visible, invited chains. But invisibility had its own dangers. One evening, a man arrived at their door just after sunset. He wore a plain coat and carried himself carefully, like someone used to watching his words. My name doesn't matter, he said. I was on the committee. Elisa stiffened. The man raised his hands. I'm not here to threaten. Here because I can't forget him. He looked at Samuel. What you did, it shattered things. Some of us cannot unsee it. Samuel studied the man's face. Then why are you here? Because there are others like you, the man said quietly. Not as advanced, perhaps, but capable. And they are being ignored or erased. Samuel said nothing. The man leaned closer. If you speak again, they will silence you permanently. But if you teach quietly, you might change something they can't easily destroy. That night, Samuel made a decision. He would not fight science head-on again. He would go around it. Children began to visit the Carter home under innocent excuses. Reading lessons, arithmetic help, nothing dramatic, nothing public. Samuel taught them how to think, not what to think, how to question assumptions, how to recognize flawed logic. He taught them to wait. Years passed. By the time Samuel was 16, whispers followed him again, but different ones. He was no longer the boy science couldn't explain. He was something more dangerous. He was the boy who made others think. One day a letter arrived with no return address. Inside was a single line written in a familiar hand. They are watching you again. Samuel folded the letter carefully. He had expected this. Outside, the world was changing. Tensions were rising, old systems were cracking. And Samuel understood something the men of science had never grasped. You did not defeat fear by confronting it. You outlived it, and when the time was right, you replaced it. By the time Samuel turned 18, the country itself felt restless. Arguments filled newspapers. Churches split. Conversations that once stayed polite now sharpened into certainty and anger. People spoke of order and collapse in the same breath. The world Samuel lived in was beginning to fracture, and fractures, he knew, were where truth slipped through. The quiet teaching stopped. Not because Samuel wanted it to, but because it had grown too visible. One evening, Eliza noticed a man standing across the street longer than necessary. Another time, a carriage passed the house twice in the same hour. Children stopped coming, one by one, their parents suddenly busy or concerned. "They're afraid again," Eliza said softly. Samuel nodded. "They always are, just before change." The letter writer returned not in person this time, but through messages passed carefully from hand to hand. The warnings were clearer now. Some of the same men who once examined Samuel were drafting new theories papers meant to quietly undo his existence. They framed intelligence as something that could appear briefly, unnaturally, then fade a mistake. An exception not to be repeated. Somewhere read the drafts when they reached him. He smiled. They were wrong in a way that mattered, because Samuel was no longer alone. In other towns, other cities, small groups had begun doing the same quiet work. Teaching, questioning, recording. The pamphlets were more careful now, less emotional, sharper in logic. They did not attack science. They used its numbers, contradictions. Their own language turned against them. One night Samuel met with 3 men and a woman in a candlelit room above a closed shop. None used their real names. They didn't need to. "What you started," one of them said, "is spreading faster than they can contain." Samuel shook his head. "I didn't start it, I survived it." The woman leaned forward. "They are planning to discredit you publicly, not imprison you, not silence you, something worse. Erase credibility," Samuel said calmly. She nodded. "They will say your childhood brilliance was exaggerated, that you declined, that you proved nothing." Samuel considered this. Then they will have to explain why so many others are now asking the same questions. Silence filled the room. For the first time, Samuel understood the shape of the ending. It would not be dramatic. There would be no apology, no public admission, just replacement. The old ideas would collapse under the weight of new minds they could not isolate fast enough. When Samuel returned home that night, Eliza was waiting. "I know that look," she said. "You're about to walk into danger again." Samuel sat beside her. "Not the same danger." She studied him. "Promise me something." He waited. "Promise me you won't disappear this time." Samuel took her hand. "I won't," he said. "They can't make me disappear anymore. I made sure of that." Outside, the night was quiet, but the quiet no longer felt empty. It felt crowded, full of thoughts that had been planted and were beginning to grow slow and stubbornly, beyond anyone's control. Samuel Carter was no longer the boy science couldn't explain. He was the proof that it had been asking the wrong questions all along. By the time Samuel was 20, the quiet work he had begun had taken root in places he had never visited. Small towns, distant villages, even some city neighborhoods now had children and young adults taught to observe, to question, to reason. Not loudly, not openly, but quietly, persistently, like roots growing beneath the soil. The men who had once examined him now watched from afar. They published carefully worded papers claiming that anomalies like Samuel were rare and fleeting, nothing more than a curiosity. But the lesson Samuel had planted could not be retracted. In Boston, a subtle debate began to emerge among scholars. Some acknowledged Samuel indirectly, some refused. Some tried to discredit him, but their attacks were transparent. They had underestimated not only him but the people who had absorbed his methods and passed them forward. Eliza watched him in the evenings, seeing the change in him. He no longer carried the fear he had once held. His brilliance was measured, controlled, and disciplined. But there was fire in his eyes, a fire that the world could no longer extinguish. One evening, a former committee member arrived quietly, knocking on the Carter home door. His face was older, tired, but curious. "You've changed things," he admitted reluctantly, "and I don't know if we can stop it." Samuel nodded. "You shouldn't try. You can't." The man hesitated. "Do you realize what this will mean for the future?" "I do," Samuel said calmly, "and that is why I act carefully." He had learned the hard way that visibility would bring danger, what influence could bring enemies, but knowledge, when passed wisely, was unstoppable. The townsfolk began to notice differences too. The children Samuel taught began asking questions adults could not answer. Farmers debated numbers and measurements in ways they never had. Shopkeepers questioned trade calculations. Even ministers paused in their sermons, noticing that their congregations were now listening with sharper minds. Samuel understood that the ultimate threat of intelligence was never brilliance itself. It was awakening, and awakening could not be controlled. By the end of the year, Samuel had become a legend, not in newspapers, not in official records, but quietly, in whispers, in careful imitation, in minds open to possibilities. Science could still not explain him. Society could still not control him. And Samuel, finally, understood the quiet power of survival coupled with education. The photograph of his childhood, once circulated to prove him a curiosity, no longer mattered. The truth had outgrown the paper. The idea had outgrown the classroom. And Samuel Carter had become something that no one, not the Institute, not the town, not the men of science could ever erase. By the time Samuel was 22, his influence had spread far beyond Blackridge. Young minds trained quietly in homes, schools, and small community gatherings were beginning to think differently. They questioned authority, patterns, and assumptions. Ideas that had once seemed dangerous were now commonplace in subtle ways. Children who had been taught Samuel's methods began to teach others. His legacy, silent but relentless, was multiplying. The men who had once examined him now watched anxiously. Some published papers claiming his intelligence was an anomaly, unsustainable and unrepeatable. Others attempted to belittle the story in private letters, yet nothing could stop what had been set in motion. The seed of curiosity was deeply planted. Samuel himself had become cautious but deliberate. He no longer sought attention or recognition. He no longer spoke in public forums. Instead, he moved strategically, mentoring promising minds and connecting with people who could carry ideas forward safely. One day, a letter arrived with an unfamiliar seal. Inside was a message from a prominent scientist who had followed Samuel's progress for years. Your existence challenges assumptions we have long held. We cannot fully understand you, but we must acknowledge that you are changing the way the next generation thinks. Continue wisely. Samuel smiled faintly. He understood the subtle warning. The same fear that had once tried to contain him still lingered. The elite of society watched his every move. Any misstep could provoke backlash. But Samuel was no longer the boy who feared adults. He was a strategist. Eliza noticed the change most of all. Her son, once vibrant with curiosity, had matured into a quiet force of patience, intelligence, and calculated action. He moved like water, soft, unseen, yet capable of wearing down stone over time. As months passed, whispers of Samuel Carter's teachings reached even the elite circles of Boston. Scholars debated whether his methods could be taught safely. Clergy murmured about the moral implications of a generation that questioned everything. Politicians worried about a populace that began thinking beyond traditional structures. Yet, Samuel remained elusive. He never sought glory. He did not demand recognition. He simply ensured that knowledge moved forward, subtly, persistently, and beyond the control of those who feared it. And in the stillness of the night, when Eliza watched him pore over books or write notes for students, she realized the truth. Samuel Carter was no longer just a boy who confounded science. He had become a movement, a quiet revolution of thought that could not be silenced. The world might try to contain brilliance, it might try to erase truth. But Samuel had already learned the ultimate lesson. Knowledge, once shared wisely, could not be stopped. The years passed, and Samuel Carter became more than a whisper in the towns and villages. He became a presence that could not be ignored, though no one fully saw him at once. His methods, his lessons, his subtle influence had taken root. Far beyond Blackridge, children he had taught carried ideas into new towns. Scholars who had once studied him quietly shared his approaches, cloaked in anonymity. What had begun as a child's survival was now an enduring movement. The elite of Boston still tried. Publications dismissed him. Committees met in secret to discuss ways to discredit his work. The same men who had once examined him now debated how to neutralize his influence. But it was too late. Samuel's legacy had outgrown the reach of any institution. His knowledge, once contained, now moved like water, slow, relentless, impossible to stop. Samuel walked the streets of Black one evening with Eliza by his side, where children waved shyly from doorways, carrying books he had sent them. Young adults approached quietly, asking questions that had once seemed impossible. The townsfolk no longer whispered with fear. Many whispered in awe. He stopped at the old schoolhouse, now abandoned to history, and looked at it with calm understanding. The very building where fear and misunderstanding at first tried to contain him had now been replaced in memory by generations he had influenced. Eliza squeezed his hand. "Do you ever wish it had been different? That it hadn't been so hard?" Samuel shook his head slowly. "No, it had to be this way. Every obstacle, every fear, every attempt to control me, it shaped how I teach, how I move, how I survive." He paused, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The light stretched across the town, golden and soft, touching every corner. "Truth cannot be imprisoned," he said finally. "It grows where it is planted, and the mind, once awakened, cannot be contained." By the end of that evening, Samuel's reputation had transformed. He was no longer the boy science couldn't explain. He had become a symbol not for fame, not for recognition, but for the quiet persistence of intellect, curiosity, and courage. In Boston, the scholars finally admitted it, quietly in letters to each other. Samuel Carter's brilliance had exposed the flaws in their assumptions. They had attempted to confine him, suppress him, and discredit him, but in doing so, they had taught the world a greater lesson. Intelligence, courage, and truth are forces that cannot be contained by fear or tradition. Samuel continued to teach, to inspire, to plant seeds of thought. The world was changing around him, slowly but inevitably. Every mind he touched, every lesson he shared, carried the legacy of the boy who could not be explained, a legacy that would last far beyond his years. And in the quiet of Blackridge, under the fading light, Samuel Carter finally smiled. He had survived the fear, the containment, the prejudice. He had outlasted the doubt of science and society alike. He had not only lived, he had shaped the future.